The Christian tradition was founded by Jesus of Nazareth in the 1st century Common Era. Initially, it was really a movement within Judaism, but in the middle of the 1st century, and this is recorded in the book of Acts in the Christian part of the Bible, Acts chapter 11, Jesus' followers began to be called Christians. Jesus is surely one of the most interesting people to have ever lived. Oddly and uniquely, many people who hate Christianity think very highly of Jesus. It's difficult to imagine what the history of the Western world would have looked like in the last 2,000 years if Jesus had never existed. In modern times, since the 1700s, there have been several quests for the historical Jesus. And this way of thinking, scholars distinguish the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith. Of course, they don't literally mean that there were two Jesuses. What they're trying to do is separate fact from fiction, the Jesus of history being the fact and the Christ of faith being the fiction. There are really large literatures about this. This discussion is still ongoing, and I'm not going to really get into them in this lecture. In my view, these types of theories tend to be too skeptical or too speculative, or, and this is a bad mix, both too skeptical and too speculative. Christ is not Jesus' last name. The word Christ in English is a transliteration of Christos in Greek, which means Messiah. It means anointed one. And you might hear people swear and say, Jesus H. Christ. Not only is Christ not his last name, but he doesn't have a middle name where the initial is H. It's a little obscure where Jesus H. Christ comes from, that phrase, but it probably comes from the first three letters of Jesus' name, Jesus in Greek. The first three letters translated into our letters are I, H, S, Jesus. And so someone must have looked at this, thought it was Jesus, Jesus, H, Christ. It's these letters. The two are in lowercase here. Jesus is the Greek version of the Hebrew name Yeshua, which is often translated Joshua, and the meaning of that name is Yahweh saves. Jesus did not write anything himself, and so no one has ever claimed to have his writings. The traditional assumption was that he taught publicly in Koine Greek, in Common Greek, which was a widely used language all around the Mediterranean in that era. There's an alternate view that some scholars hold, that instead Jesus taught in the language called Aramaic. Aramaic is closely related to Hebrew, and many Jews in Palestine used it during Jesus' day. He does, in Matthew chapter 27 and Mark chapter 15, cry out to God when he's being crucified. He cries out a sentence in the Aramaic language. Of course, it could well be that he knew both these languages, that sometimes he used one and sometimes he used the other. However, all of the books in the New Testament are written in Koine Greek. Scholars believe that's the original language for all of them. Since Jesus didn't write anything, he doesn't tell us his own story in his own words. His story is told 4 times in the Christian part of the Bible, which Christians call the New Testament. The word gospel literally means good news. None of the 4 gospels bear the author's own name, but since very early times they've been attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and so those are the traditional names of these gospels. The first 3 are today called the Synoptic Gospels. The first one, the very first book in the New Testament, is supposed to be by one of Jesus' 12 original apostles. Mark is traditionally believed to have been written by a man named Mark, who was not an apostle but was a companion of Peter. And Luke is traditionally believed to have been a Gentile doctor, so not a Jew, and a companion of the famous apostle Paul, who, as we'll see, did not know Jesus during his ministry before his crucifixion, but claimed that the risen Jesus appeared to him. These are the traditional authors of the first 3 Gospels, and also this is the traditionally believed order in which they were written. But many scholars are skeptical in varying degrees about these claims nowadays. As I said, the books don't tell us who their author is, and more importantly, there seems to be a dependence between them. Close study has brought about widespread agreement that Mark was the first Gospel, and that Matthew and Luke reused and adapted portions of Mark. Therefore, Mark must have been the earliest. Mark is nowadays dated from between the year 55 to 70, Common Era, and just about all of it gets reproduced in Matthew and Luke. Evidently, the authors of Matthew and Luke thought that Mark needed some expansion, needed some additional material added to it. There's also a hypothetical source, which scholars call Q, which just means quelle in Latin, source. And this is hypothesized. They've never found Q or anything claiming to be Q. It's a hypothesized source. It just contains the additional material that's in both Matthew and Luke that's not in Mark. Was there ever any such gospel as that provided material to Matthew and Luke in addition to what was in Mark? Some scholars think so, but others argue strenuously that one of those other two just used the other. We don't have to hypothesize some additional gospel. I think it's right that one should be skeptical about the hypothesis of Q. Matthew and Luke, then, are dated to various times after Mark, and a good bit later, most scholars would date the Gospel of John. The most common date is somewhere around 95 Common Era. Again, not all scholars agree. Some would place it earlier. It is interesting that John is very different from the first three. It doesn't cut and paste any of the material. It's just a very different book. The language is different. It has more long, extended speeches. The order of some of the events is different. Traditionally, it's believed to have been written by John, one of Jesus' 12 apostles, indeed one of the few apostles that was kind of in Jesus' inner circle. Traditionally, these are viewed as 4 sources of information about Jesus. A lot of scholars now are skeptical about John. They think it's just later and incorporates later ideas. They see John as less connected with the historical Jesus than the 3 earlier Gospels. But interestingly, these are not our only ancient sources of information about Jesus. In addition to the 4 Gospels, which as we've seen are not 4 independent sources, although they are different sources, we also have some very early writings by Saul of Tarsus, also called Paul, whom we'll discuss in a future lecture. Paul died somewhere between 64 and 67 Common Era, and a number of his letters are incorporated in the Christian New Testament. Some of them are disputed. That is, some scholars argue that they're not really by Paul, but by a later person writing in Paul's name, and some of his letters are undisputed. The undisputed letters, every scholar now thinks, was written by Paul. They have a certain vocabulary and style and a certain personality that comes through them. There are 7 undisputed letters of Paul, and these are from the 50s and the 60s. And then there are disputed letters. Those are 6 more. But even if you just disregard the disputed letters and focus on the undisputed letters, there's a good bit of information in there about Jesus, even though none of them tells the complete story of Jesus. It presupposes that the audience already knows about him. We also have some other Gospels that didn't get into the New Testament. We'll talk about why in the last segment of this lecture. These other Gospels exist mostly in fragmentary form. That is, we don't have the whole book, but we just have a page or half a page of it or a couple pages of it. Some of these Gospels may have meaningful evidence regarding the life of Jesus, even though they are from the 2nd century, that is from the 100s, and not from the 1st century when Jesus lived. Others of them not so much. We also have a few mentions of Christianity and Christians, and even a mention or two of Jesus that are from late 1st century and early 2nd century non-Christian sources. Little bits of information like Roman officials discussing what to do with the Christians, a little mention in the famous Jewish historian Josephus, and things like that. All of this evidence put together, although it does have its problems, there are inconsistencies between the Gospels. There's plenty of room to argue about how reliable the Gospels are. This evidence altogether, for most historians, makes it compelling to believe that there was a real Jesus, that Jesus was not an entirely fictional character. If you go back and look at our lecture in this course on the life of the historical Buddha, the life of Gautama, look at the time gaps there between when Gautama is believed to have died and then when the earliest writings are from, and compare those time gaps to the life of Jesus. And you'll see that the case for believing in a historical Jesus is much stronger. And consequently, historians will say there's a lot more that we can be pretty sure about when it comes to the historical Jesus as compared to the historical Buddha. What's the time gap? Well, Jesus is crucified somewhere around the year 30. The sources we've just been discussing come before the year 100. And then just for good measure, we've thrown in some bits of evidence that are from somewhat after 100. But it all paints a fairly consistent picture of a 1st century Jewish teacher. The Bible doesn't tell us as much information as we would like to have about Jesus. You could describe the style of the Gospels as minimalistic in that it tells as much information as is necessary to drive the story forward. It's the story of God sending his Messiah into the world to, in some sense, be the Savior. It tells us then about Jesus' public deeds and about his public teachings and about his public death, but it doesn't tell us any physical description of him. It doesn't tell us if his hair was light or dark, if he was tall or short. It doesn't tell us very much about his childhood and other things that would interest modern biographers. But these books have a mission. They have an understandable narrative that they want to communicate. And they are a lot like modern biographies, but they're not nearly as detailed. And you have to remember that in this day, books had to be hand-copied. So you couldn't set out to write a 1,000-page tome on every detail of someone's life. You know, you'd write a 30-page tome, the kind of thing that could be copied and recopied and passed around. In our next segment, the life of Jesus according to the Gospel of Luke.